The phone call from my daughter came at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I know this because I was staring at the kitchen clock, wondering if I should start dinner preparations early or wait for Margaret to get home from her book club meeting. The familiar chime of my cell phone broke the afternoon silence, and Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Hey, Dad, how are you holding up?" Her voice carried that careful tone she'd been using since her mother and I had been having our rough patch. Not that we told her about the arguments, but daughters have a way of sensing these things. I settled into my favorite armchair, the one Margaret always complained made our living room look too casual. "I'm doing fine, sweetheart. Just finished reviewing some contract proposals for next month's projects." The lie came easily. I'd actually been sitting there for the better part of an hour, replaying last night's conversation with Margaret about our finances, trying to figure out when exactly she'd become so interested in the detailed breakdown of our assets. "That's good to hear. Listen, I was wondering if you could do me a favor and check on Dan sometime this week. He's been working on this massive case, practically living at the office, and I'm worried he's not eating properly or taking care of himself." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest at the mention of my son-in-law. Dan Thompson had always struck me as the type of man who calculated every word before speaking, measured every gesture for maximum impact. In the 3 years since he'd married Sarah, I tried to warm up to him, but something about his polished exterior never quite sat right with me. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll swing by his place later this week. Maybe bring him some of those sandwiches he likes from Morton's Deli." "You're the best, Dad. I'm flying out to Portland tomorrow morning for that conference I mentioned, so I won't be back until Friday. It would mean a lot to me knowing someone's keeping an eye on him." After we hung up, I found myself walking to the window that overlooked our backyard. 25 years of marriage had taught me to read the subtle signs of change, and lately, Margaret had been different. Not dramatically different, but different enough that I noticed. The way she'd started asking detailed questions about my business partnerships, the sudden interest in estate planning, the new habit of taking phone calls in the other room. Maybe I was overthinking things. Construction work had always made me methodical, careful about details, but sometimes that same attention to detail could turn into paranoia about nothing. Margaret was probably just being practical, thinking about our future now that we were both in our 60s. Thursday afternoon found me driving through the familiar streets of Riverside Heights, where Dan and Sarah had bought their house 2 years ago. It was the kind of neighborhood that whispered success without shouting it, where the lawns were professionally maintained and the mailboxes all matched the architectural style of their respective homes. I'd always been proud that my construction business had done well enough to help them with the down payment. Not that Dan had asked for help directly, but when Sarah mentioned they were struggling to come up with the full amount in Denver's competitive market, what kind of father would I be if I didn't step in? The $80,000 had come from our retirement savings, but seeing Sarah happy in her dream home had made the sacrifice worthwhile. As I turned onto Maple Street, I was already planning what I'd say to Dan. Maybe suggest we grab dinner somewhere, give him a chance to unwind and talk about whatever case was consuming his time. Sarah had mentioned it was some kind of complex divorce proceeding, which explained why he'd been so stressed lately. That's when I saw the car. Margaret's silver Lexus sat in Dan's driveway like an accusation, its chrome bumper catching the afternoon sunlight. For a moment, I thought I was seeing things. I pulled over to the curb across the street and stared, my mind struggling to process what my eyes were telling me. Margaret was supposed to be at her pottery class. Every Thursday from 2 to 5, she attended the community center workshop with 3 other women from our neighborhood. She'd been going for almost 2 years now, usually coming home with clay-stained fingernails and stories about glazing techniques or the latest gossip from the other participants. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I tried to think of innocent explanations. Maybe she'd finished early and stopped by to check on Dan too. Maybe Sarah had asked both of us to look in on him, and somehow the wires got crossed. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for why my wife's car was parked outside my son-in-law's house when she was supposed to be molding ceramic bowls. I sat there for nearly 10 minutes, watching the house for any sign of movement. The curtains were drawn, which struck me as odd since Dan usually preferred natural light when he was working. Sarah had mentioned how he'd set up his home office in the front room specifically because it got the best afternoon sun. The rational part of my mind kept offering harmless scenarios. Margaret could be helping Dan with something. Maybe he'd asked for her opinion on a legal matter, or she was bringing him food since Sarah was out of town. These were all perfectly normal things that family members did for each other. But something cold was settling in my stomach, a feeling I'd learned to trust after 35 years in business. It was the same instinct that had warned me away from contractors who seemed too eager to please, or clients whose stories didn't quite add up. The details weren't fitting together the way they should. I turned off my engine and sat in the growing silence. The neighborhood was quiet at this time of day, most people still at work, children not yet home from school. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, completely focused on her run. A mail truck turned the corner, stopping at each house with mechanical precision. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. Just another Thursday afternoon in an upscale suburban neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever happened. But my wife's car was in the wrong driveway, and no amount of reasonable explanations could shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Margaret's contact. My thumb hovered over the call button for several seconds before I changed my mind. If there was an innocent explanation, calling her would just make me look paranoid and controlling. If there wasn't an innocent explanation, well, a phone call would give her the chance to prepare whatever story she needed to tell. Instead, I decided to trust my instincts. The same instincts that had built a successful business from nothing, that had guided me through countless negotiations and difficult decisions over the years. Something was happening in that house, and as Margaret's husband and Dan's father-in-law, I had every right to find out what it was. I climbed out of my car and walked slowly toward the house, my footsteps muffled by the well-maintained sidewalk. The afternoon air carried the scent of fresh mulch and the distant sound of a lawnmower from several streets over. Everything felt surreal, like I was walking through someone else's life instead of my own. As I approached the front porch, I could hear voices coming from inside. The sound was too muffled to make out specific words, but I could distinguish two distinct speakers. One was definitely Margaret's voice, with its particular cadence and inflection that I'd been listening to for 25 years. The other was unmistakably Dan's measured baritone. They were having what sounded like an intense conversation, their voices carrying an urgency that didn't match any innocent scenario I'd been imagining. I found myself moving toward the side of the house, where a large window looked into what I knew was Dan's home office. The curtains were partially open, just enough to create a narrow gap that provided a clear view into the room. What I saw through that gap would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and the people I trusted most in the world. Margaret sat on the leather couch that Sarah and Dan had bought last year, her posture relaxed and comfortable in a way that suggested this wasn't her first visit to this room. Dan stood near his desk, holding what looked like a manila folder filled with documents. Both of them wore expressions I'd never seen before, focused and calculating in a way that made my chest tighten with apprehension. I pressed myself closer to the window, straining to hear their conversation through the glass. The sound was still muffled, but I could catch fragments of sentences, enough to understand that they weren't discussing pottery classes or legal cases or any of the mundane topics I'd been expecting. They were talking about money. Specifically, they were talking about my money. The words came through the glass like shards of ice, each syllable driving deeper into my chest. Margaret's voice, normally soft and melodic when she spoke to me, carried a sharp edge I'd never heard before. The construction business alone is worth $12 million, maybe more if we include the equipment and pending contracts. Her tone was businesslike, clinical, as if she were discussing stock portfolios rather than the life's work I'd built with my own hands. Dan nodded, scribbling something on a legal pad. And the rental properties? 4 buildings, fully occupied. The income statements show about $8,000 monthly after expenses. Plus there's the vacation cabin in Aspen, the boat, the investment accounts. Margaret paused, and I watched her lean forward with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Dan, we're looking at close to $20 million total. $20 million. The number hit me like a physical blow, not because it was wrong, but because it was exactly right. Down to the last detail, Margaret had cataloged every asset, every investment, every piece of property I'd accumulated over 3 decades of 16-hour workdays and careful financial planning. The timeline's perfect, Dan said, his lawyer voice crisp with satisfaction. File the papers in June, claim irreconcilable differences. With the new state statutes, Margaret's entitled to half of everything acquired during the marriage, plus spousal support for life. Margaret laughed, and the sound that had once made me fall in love with her now felt like poison in my veins. 25 years of playing the devoted wife, she said, examining her manicured nails with casual indifference. God, the man actually believes I love him. The world tilted sideways. I gripped the window frame to steady myself, my knuckles going white against the painted wood. 25 years of marriage, reduced to a performance. Every anniversary dinner, every shared laugh, every whispered, "I love you" in the darkness had been nothing more than an elaborate act designed to keep me working, earning, building wealth she could eventually claim as her own. The beautiful part is his trusting nature, Dan continued, gesturing toward a manila folder on the coffee table. Alan has no idea we've been documenting his assets for months. Bank statements, property deeds, business valuations, everything's already copied and organized. I stared at that folder, understanding now why Margaret had suddenly become so interested in our finances. The questions about business partnerships, the requests to see tax returns, the insistence on joint accounts for everything. She hadn't been planning for our future together. She'd been conducting reconnaissance for our destruction. He practically handed us the keys to his kingdom, Dan said with obvious satisfaction. Never questioned why you needed copies of the financial statements. Never wondered why you were suddenly so interested in estate planning. Margaret stood and walked to the window, so close I could have reached out and touched the glass between us. 2 years of pretending to care about his boring construction stories, nodding sympathetically when he worried about payroll or weather delays. Her voice dripped with contempt. The man actually thinks I'm proud of what he's built. I pressed myself against the brick wall, my heart hammering so hard I was certain they could hear it through the window. A twig snapped under my foot, and both of them froze mid-conversation, their heads turning toward the sound like startled deer. "Did you hear something?" Margaret's voice carried a note of suspicion that cut through the afternoon air. "Probably just the neighbor's cat," Dan replied after a pause. "You're being paranoid." "Can you blame me? If Alan discovered this before we're ready?" "He won't," Dan interrupted with a laugh that held nothing but contempt. "The man couldn't spot a conspiracy if it wore a neon sign. By September, you'll be divorced, wealthy, and free to do whatever you want with whoever you want." I forced myself to remain hidden until their conversation resumed, my phone trembling in my hand as I hit the record button, just as Dan continued his legal dissertation. Every word they spoke was another nail in the coffin of everything I'd believed about my life, my marriage, my family. "We've been positioning ourselves perfectly," Margaret said, settling back onto the couch. "The separate credit cards I insisted on for my personal expenses, the documentation of every financial decision you've made without consulting me, the gradual building of a case for financial control and manipulation." Dan nodded approvingly. "Classic preparation for a high-asset divorce. By the time we file, we'll have everything we need to paint you as a controlling husband who used money to manipulate and isolate his wife." The irony was breathtaking. They were planning to weaponize my generosity, turning every gift, every luxury, every comfortable lifestyle choice into evidence of systematic abuse. The same man who'd worked double shifts to pay for Margaret's dream kitchen would be portrayed as a financial tyrant who'd trapped his wife in golden chains. "What about Sarah?" Margaret asked. "She's not going to automatically take my side. Her psychology training makes her skeptical of everything." Dan's expression shifted to something calculating and cold. "That's actually perfect. Sarah's hesitation to immediately support you becomes evidence of how thoroughly Alan has manipulated family dynamics. We position her professional training as something Alan exploited to turn his own daughter against her mother's emotional needs." I felt sick. They were planning to drag Sarah into this nightmare, using her education and professional ethics as weapons against both of us. My daughter, who'd spent years studying human behavior and family dynamics, would become an unwitting pawn in their scheme to destroy me. "The documentation is key," Dan continued, pulling papers from the folder. "Every joint account, every shared investment, every piece of property acquired during the marriage. I've been copying everything for months, building a complete financial profile that shows exactly how much you deserve." Deserve. As if 25 years of supporting someone you loved was some kind of debt that needed to be collected with interest. As if the dreams we'd shared, the life we'd built together, the future we'd planned was nothing more than a business transaction waiting to be liquidated. Margaret walked to Dan's desk and picked up another document. "The prenup we signed was so simple back then. Just basic asset protection for what we each brought into the marriage. Alan was making maybe $60,000 a year when we got married. Neither of us imagined the business would grow like this." "Which works in our favor," Dan replied. "The bulk of the wealth was accumulated during the marriage, which means it's all community property subject to division. Plus, your contribution as a homemaker and business supporter establishes your right to ongoing spousal support. Business supporter. I almost laughed at the phrase. Margaret had attended exactly 3 company functions in the past 5 years, and each time she'd complained about having to make small talk with contractors and suppliers, she considered beneath her social station. The house alone is worth $2 million now, Margaret said, running her finger down a property assessment report. Remember when Alan insisted on buying in that neighborhood because it was a good investment? He was right about that, at least. The house, our home. The place where we'd hosted Sarah's graduation party, where we'd celebrated anniversaries and holidays, where I'd carried Margaret over the threshold as newlyweds full of hope and dreams for the future. To her, it was just another asset to be divided, another line item in the dissolution of our marriage. We need to be careful about the timing, Dan warned. File too early, and Alan might have time to reorganize his assets. File too late, and we might miss the optimal window for settlement negotiations. June is perfect, Margaret agreed. Sarah will be busy with her practice expansion. Alan will be focused on the Morrison project. He'll be completely blindsided. No time to mount an effective defense. They had thought of everything: the timing, the documentation, the narrative they would present to the court. While I'd been working 16-hour days to secure our financial future, they'd been systematically planning its destruction. Every late night at the office, every weekend spent reviewing contracts and proposals, had given them more time to organize their conspiracy. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I quickly silenced it before checking the screen. Sarah's name appeared with a message. "Thanks again for checking on Dan. You're the best father-in-law ever." The best father-in-law ever. If she only knew what her husband was planning, how he was using her absence to plot against her family. The man she'd married, the person she trusted with her future, was actively working to destroy the father who'd helped make their life together possible. I looked back through the window and saw Dan showing Margaret another document. "This is the asset protection strategy we'll use if Alan tries to fight the settlement. Offshore accounts, business restructuring, hiding assets through shell companies. We've researched all his possible moves and prepared countermeasures for each one." The casual way they discussed destroying my life's work was perhaps the most chilling aspect of their conversation. These weren't desperate people acting out of emotion or financial necessity. This was calculated, methodical, and completely premeditated. They had been planning this for months, maybe years, while I'd been living in blissful ignorance of their true intentions. Margaret glanced at her watch. "I need to leave soon. Pottery class ends at 5, and I told Alan I'd be home by 6. Pottery class. Another lie in the growing web of deception that had apparently been my marriage for longer than I cared to imagine. How many Thursday afternoons had she spent here instead of at the community center? How many other lies had I swallowed without question? "Just a few more details to finalize," Dan said, pulling out his phone. "I've been in contact with Patricia Morrison at the Tribune. She owes me a favor from the Henderson custody case last year." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "The newspaper? What does journalism have to do with our situation?" "Public opinion matters in high-profile divorces," Dan explained, his voice taking on the calculated tone I'd heard him use with difficult clients. "If we need to apply pressure, a well-placed story about financial abuse can be incredibly effective. Paint Alan as the controlling businessman who isolated his wife from their shared assets." The mention of Patricia Morrison sent a chill down my spine. I knew that name from the local business community. She'd written several pieces about construction industry practices, always with a slight bias against larger companies like mine. The idea that they were already preparing media manipulation as part of their strategy showed just how thoroughly they'd planned this assault. "Brilliant," Margaret said, and I could hear the admiration in her voice. "Alan's always been so concerned about his reputation in the community. Bad publicity would destroy him faster than any legal proceeding." They were right about that. In the construction business, reputation was everything. One negative story about financial impropriety or domestic abuse allegations could cost me every major contract I'd worked years to secure. Clients didn't want to associate with scandal, even if the accusations were completely fabricated. Dan scrolled through his phone. "I've already drafted a basic narrative. Successful businessman gradually becomes controlling and manipulative as his wealth grows. Wife endures years of financial abuse before finally finding the courage to escape. It's a story that writes itself." "What about evidence?" Margaret asked. "Won't they want documentation of actual abuse?" "That's where your psychology background comes in handy." Dan replied with a smile that made my stomach turn. You've been reading those self-help books about emotional manipulation for months. You understand the terminology, the patterns, the way these situations typically develop. Margaret had indeed been reading those books. I'd noticed them around the house, titles about narcissistic abuse and financial control. At the time, I'd assumed she was trying to understand some friend's relationship problems or maybe doing research for a book club discussion. Now I realized she'd been studying the playbook for destroying me. The beauty of emotional abuse claims, Dan continued, is that they're almost impossible to disprove. Alan's generosity becomes evidence of control. His success becomes proof of manipulation. Every time he made a financial decision without extensive consultation, we frame it as evidence of his systematic isolation tactics. I watched Margaret nod enthusiastically, completely absorbed in the strategy session. This was the woman who'd cried tears of joy when I'd surprised her with a weekend trip to Napa Valley for our 20th anniversary. The same person who'd told everyone at her bridge club how lucky she was to have such a thoughtful, hardworking husband. All lies. Every moment of apparent happiness, every expression of gratitude, every shared dream about our retirement years had been nothing more than an elaborate performance designed to keep me working, earning, building the fortune she was now planning to steal. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Dan said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. The prenuptial agreement. Margaret's expression tightened slightly. What about it? It's basic, but it exists. Alan's attorney might try to use it to limit your claim to assets acquired during the marriage. Dan pulled out a thick folder I hadn't noticed before. I've been researching precedent cases where prenups were challenged successfully. On what grounds? Duress, inadequate representation, failure to fully disclose assets. Dan's voice took on the confident rhythm of a lawyer who'd found his winning argument. Alan makes significantly more money now than when you married. His business has grown exponentially. We argue that the original agreement was based on incomplete financial projections. Margaret leaned forward with interest. Would that actually work? With the right judge and the right circumstances, absolutely. Especially if we can demonstrate that Alan used his superior business knowledge to manipulate you into signing an unfavorable agreement. The revisionist history they were creating was breathtaking in its audacity. The prenup had been Margaret's idea originally, suggested by her father who'd been through an expensive divorce himself. I'd actually resisted it at first, thinking it showed a lack of faith in our relationship. But Margaret had insisted, claiming it would protect both of us and make the marriage feel more like an equal partnership. Now they were planning to turn that decision into evidence of my manipulative nature, painting me as a scheming businessman who tricked his innocent young wife into signing away her rights. The truth was exactly the opposite, but truth seemed to be optional in their version of events. What's the timeline for challenging the prenup? Margaret asked. We file the divorce papers first, then immediately follow with a motion to invalidate the prenuptial agreement. The key is to overwhelm Alan's legal team with multiple fronts of attack before they can mount an effective defense. Dan walked to his filing cabinet and pulled out another folder, this one even thicker than the first. I've been documenting every aspect of your marriage that could support our case. Financial decisions made without consultation, social events you were excluded from, business meetings where your input was dismissed. I stared through the window in growing horror as I realized the scope of their preparation. Dan hadn't just been planning this for months, he'd been building a case for years, documenting every interaction, every decision, every moment of our marriage that could be twisted into evidence of abuse or manipulation. Margaret opened the folder and began flipping through pages of notes, photographs, and printed documents. This is incredibly thorough, Dan. When did you start collecting all this? Right after Sarah mentioned her concerns about your marriage during last year's Thanksgiving dinner. She said something about how quiet you'd become around your father, how you seemed to defer to his opinions more than you used to. My heart sank as I realized they'd been manipulating my daughter's professional observations, turning her trained eye for family dynamics into ammunition for their legal war. Sarah had probably mentioned her concerns out of genuine care for her mother's well-being, never imagining that her husband would use those observations to build a case against her father. Sarah's testimony will be crucial, Dan continued. As a licensed psychologist, her professional opinion about family dysfunction carries significant weight in court. But she loves her father, Margaret protested. She's not going to automatically take my side. She doesn't need to take sides, Dan explained with the patience of someone who'd thought through every angle. She just needs to testify honestly about what she's observed. Her professional training will make her descriptions more credible than typical family testimony. They were planning to weaponize my daughter's love for both her parents, using her professional integrity against her, while destroying the family she'd grown up believing in. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Margaret closed the folder and looked directly at Dan with an expression I'd never seen before. It was cold, calculating, and completely devoid of the warmth I'd associated with her for 25 years. "When do we make our move?" "June 15th, Dan replied without hesitation. "Sarah will be in Portland for that conference. You'll be at your sister's house in Phoenix visiting your new nephew, and Alan will be completely focused on the Morrison contract deadline." The Morrison contract, the biggest project of my career, worth over $15 million and representing everything I'd worked toward for 3 decades. They'd planned their attack for the exact moment when I'd be most vulnerable, most distracted, least able to mount an effective defense. "Perfect," Margaret said with satisfaction. "By the time anyone realizes what's happening, it'll be too late for Alan to protect his assets or prepare a counter strategy." Dan nodded. "I'll file the papers at 8 a.m. sharp. Emergency restraining orders preventing asset movement, immediate spousal support of $12,000 monthly, and temporary exclusive occupancy of the marital home. $12,000 monthly. More than most people made in salary, demanded as pocket money while they systematically dismantled everything I'd built. The marital home that I'd designed and partially constructed with my own hands would become Margaret's exclusive domain, while I was forced into some temporary housing arrangement. "What about his business?" Margaret asked. "Can we claim part of that too?" "Colorado is a marital property state," Dan explained. "Any business growth during the marriage is subject to division. I've already had the company valued by 3 independent assessors. We're looking at a claim worth approximately $6 million. $6 million from the business that had consumed my life for 35 years. The company I'd built from a single truck and a borrowed tool set, nurtured through recessions and boom times, grown into an operation that employed 43 people and their families. They wanted to carve it up like a Thanksgiving turkey." Margaret stood and walked to the window again, so close to where I was hiding that I could see the satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "It's almost poetic, isn't it? All those years of Alan thinking he was building something permanent, something that would outlast us both. Instead, he was just making us rich. The casual dismissal of my life's work, the reduction of 35 years of dedication and sacrifice to nothing more than a financial opportunity, hit me harder than any of their other revelations. This wasn't just about money or property division. They were planning to destroy everything that gave my life meaning and purpose. "There's one more thing," Dan said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "We need to be prepared for Alan to fight back. He's not stupid, and he's got resources. If he discovers our plan before we execute it, he might try to hide assets or reorganize the business structure." Margaret turned away from the window, her expression serious. "What kind of countermeasures are you thinking? Offshore accounts, shell companies, asset transfers to business partners, classic wealthy divorce tactics." Dan pulled out yet another folder from his seemingly endless collection. "I've researched every possible move he might make and prepared legal challenges for each one. The depth of their preparation was staggering. While I'd been trusting them implicitly, working long hours to provide for our future, they'd been studying me like a specimen under a microscope, anticipating every possible reaction to their betrayal. The key is maintaining the element of surprise," Dan continued. "As long as Alan believes he's living in a happy marriage, he won't take defensive action. The moment he suspects something, everything becomes more complicated." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "That's why these meetings are so important. We need to finalize every detail before June 15th. No room for improvisation once we pull the trigger. Pull the trigger. Military terminology for what they were planning to do to my life, my family, my future." The casual violence of the phrase perfectly captured the calculated nature of their assault. "I should go," Margaret said, glancing at her watch again. "Alan will be expecting me home soon, and I can't afford to raise any suspicions at this stage." She gathered her purse and moved toward the door, then paused as if remembering something important. "Dan, what happens if Alan tries to reconcile? What if he offers to go to counseling or make changes to save the marriage?" Dan's smile was cold and predatory. "That's the beauty of our strategy, Margaret. By the time Alan realizes what's happening, reconciliation won't be an option. The restraining orders, the abuse allegations, the media coverage. It all becomes part of the legal record. Even if he wanted to save the marriage, the court proceedings will have their own momentum. Margaret nodded with obvious satisfaction. Good. I've invested too much time in this plan to let sentimentality derail it now. Sentimentality. 25 years of marriage reduced to an inconvenient emotion that might interfere with their financial objectives. I pressed myself harder against the brick wall, fighting the urge to burst through that door and confront them both with the recording I'd been making on my phone. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the same strategic thinking that had built my business, or maybe it was simple self-preservation. Either way, I realized that confronting them now would only give them time to adjust their plans, to prepare new lies, to find ways to turn my knowledge of their conspiracy against me. Instead, I forced myself to stay hidden and keep listening as they finalized the details of my destruction. Every word they spoke was another piece of evidence, another nail in the coffin of their credibility when the time came to fight back. And I would fight back. They had made one crucial mistake in all their careful planning. They'd underestimated the man they were trying to destroy. I watched them shake hands like business partners closing a profitable deal, their casual demeanor making my stomach churn. 25 years of marriage, and Margaret was discussing its destruction with the same tone she might use to plan a dinner party? Remember, Dan said as Margaret gathered her things, from now until June 15th, everything has to appear completely normal. No changes in behavior, no unusual questions, no deviation from your regular routines. Margaret nodded, checking her reflection in the window that separated us. Don't worry, I've been practicing this performance for 2 years. Alan suspects nothing. 2 years, the timeline hit me like a physical blow. This hadn't been a recent decision born from some marital crisis I'd failed to notice. They'd been planning this systematic betrayal for 2 full years while I'd been working myself to exhaustion, believing I was building something permanent for our family. What about the emotional preparation? Dan asked, his voice taking on a clinical tone that made my skin crawl. Court proceedings can be intense, especially when you're portraying yourself as an abuse victim. You'll need to be convincing. Margaret's laugh was sharp and calculating. That's the easy part. I've been documenting Alan's controlling behavior for months. Every time he makes a decision without consulting me, every instance of him prioritizing work over my needs, every moment where his business success overshadows my contributions to our marriage. I thought about all those late nights at job sites, the weekend emergencies that pulled me away from family dinners, the times I'd had to cancel plans because a project deadline couldn't wait. In my mind, those sacrifices had been for our future, for Margaret's security, for the comfortable retirement we'd planned together. In her twisted narrative, they'd become evidence of systematic abuse. The key is emotional authenticity, Dan continued, sounding like a director coaching an actress. When you testify about feeling isolated and controlled, you need to genuinely access those emotions. Think about times when Alan's business decisions affected your life without your input. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, as if practicing the performance. That's not difficult. Every major purchase, every investment decision, every business expansion, he presents them as done deals rather than asking for my opinion. It's been patronizing for years. The revisionist history they were creating made me dizzy with its audacity. Margaret had never shown interest in business decisions beyond how they affected our lifestyle. When I tried to include her in financial planning discussions, she'd usually deferred to my expertise, saying she trusted my judgment completely. Now that trust was being weaponized against me, perfect, Dan said with obvious satisfaction. That emotional foundation will make your testimony incredibly compelling. Judges respond to authentic feeling trauma, especially when it's delivered by someone as articulate and sympathetic as you are. Margaret preened at the compliment, straightening her shoulders with renewed confidence. What about character witnesses? Won't the court want to hear from people who know us as a couple? I've been thinking about that, Dan replied, pulling out his phone to check notes. Your sister Linda has already agreed to testify about changes she's observed in your behavior over the years. How you've become more withdrawn, more deferential to Alan's wishes. Linda, Margaret's younger sister who'd never liked me from the day we met, who'd always thought Margaret had married beneath her station. Of course, she'd be eager to support any narrative that painted me as the villain in our marriage's collapse. What about our friends? Margaret asked. The Pattersons, the Hendersons, people who've socialized with us for years? Dan's expression grew more serious. That's where we need to be strategic. Some of your mutual friends might be hesitant to take sides in a divorce proceeding. but I've identified several who've made comments over the years about Alan's work obsession or his tendency to dominate conversations about business. The casual way they discuss manipulating our social circle, turning years of friendship into legal ammunition, revealed the true depth of their conspiracy. These weren't desperate people acting impulsively. This was a calculated campaign designed to isolate me completely while building Margaret's case for maximum financial gain. There's something else we need to address, Dan said, his tone shifting to something more urgent. Alan's relationship with Sarah. She's going to be caught in the middle of this, and her reaction could significantly impact the proceedings. Margaret's expression tightened with what looked like genuine concern for the first time in their entire conversation. Sarah adores her father. She's not going to automatically believe abuse allegations, especially without concrete evidence. That's actually perfect for our strategy, Dan replied, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. Sarah's initial skepticism will appear to support our narrative about how effectively Alan has manipulated family dynamics. A trained psychologist who can't immediately recognize abuse patterns in her own family, it reinforces how sophisticated and subtle Alan's control tactics have been. My chest tightened as I realized they were planning to use my daughter's love and professional integrity against both of us. Sarah's natural tendency to analyze situations objectively, her reluctance to rush to judgment, qualities that made her an excellent therapist, would be twisted into evidence of my supposed manipulation. What if she refuses to testify at all? Margaret asked. What if she tries to stay neutral? Dan's smile was predatory. Neutrality is a position, Margaret. If Sarah refuses to support her mother during abuse proceedings, that becomes part of our story. We paint it as evidence of how thoroughly Alan has poisoned her against you, how completely he's controlled the family narrative. The breathtaking cynicism of their approach left me speechless. No matter how Sarah responded to their accusations, they'd already prepared ways to use her reaction against me. My daughter's love for both her parents would become a weapon in their legal arsenal. We should also prepare for the possibility that Alan might try to turn Sarah against the proceedings, Dan continued. He might share financial information with her, try to make her see the divorce as a money grab rather than an escape from abuse. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. That's where my relationship with her becomes crucial. 28 years of being her mother carries more weight than any financial documents Alan might show her. The casual confidence with which she discussed manipulating our daughter made me physically ill. This was the woman who'd rocked Sarah to sleep as a baby, who'd attended every school play and soccer game, who'd cried tears of pride at her graduation from psychology school. Now she was planning to weaponize that maternal bond for financial gain. There's one more family dynamic we need to consider, Dan said, consulting another page in his endless notes. Alan's relationship with his business partners. If we're claiming part ownership of the company, we need to understand how they might react to divorce proceedings. Margaret leaned forward with interest. What do you mean? Construction partnerships often have buy-sell agreements that could be triggered by divorce proceedings, Dan explained. If Alan's partners feel threatened by the possibility of an ex-wife becoming a business owner, they might try to force him out entirely. The implications hit me like a sledgehammer. My partners, men I'd worked alongside for over a decade, who'd trusted me with their investments and their families' futures, would be dragged into this nightmare. The business relationships I'd spent years cultivating could be destroyed by legal proceedings designed to extract maximum financial damage. That could work in our favor, Margaret said with obvious excitement. If they buy Alan out to avoid dealing with divorce complications, the payout would be immediate and substantial. Dan nodded approvingly. Exactly. Instead of claiming partial ownership in an ongoing business, you'd receive a share of the buyout proceeds, much cleaner from a legal perspective, and it forces immediate liquefaction of assets. They were planning to destroy not just my marriage and my relationship with my daughter, but potentially my entire professional life as well. The company I'd helped build from nothing would become collateral damage in their quest for financial revenge. What's the timeline for business disruption? Margaret asked, pulling out her own phone to make notes. The moment divorce papers are filed, Alan's partners will be notified about potential claims against company assets, Dan explained. Most partnership agreements include provisions for handling such situations, usually involving mandatory mediation or forced sale of the affected partner's interest. I thought about my partners, Jim Morrison, whose construction loan I'd co-signed when he was starting out, Dave Patterson, whose son I'd hired as an apprentice electrician, Mike Chen, who'd become like a brother over 15 years of working together. These men trusted me. depended on me, treated me like family. Now they'd be forced to choose between protecting their own investments and supporting someone who'd become a legal liability. The psychological impact on Alan could be significant. Dan continued with clinical detachment, losing his marriage, his relationship with his daughter, and potentially his business all at once. That kind of comprehensive destruction often leads to poor decision making and emotional responses that can be used against him in court. Margaret's eyes gleamed with something that looked almost predatory. You mean he might do something stupid that would support our abuse allegations? Precisely. Angry confrontations, attempts to access restricted accounts, violations of restraining orders. Desperate men often provide the evidence we need to strengthen our case. They were counting on my desperation, planning to use my emotional response to their betrayal as additional ammunition against me. The more I fought back, the more controlling and dangerous I would appear to be. It was a psychological trap designed to turn my natural reactions into legal weapons. What if he doesn't take the bait? Margaret asked. What if Alan responds calmly and legally to everything we do? Dan's confidence never wavered. Then we escalate. Anonymous tips to professional licensing boards about business irregularities, media coverage of the abuse allegations, social pressure from mutual friends who've been given selected information about the marriage. The scope of their planned destruction was breathtaking in its thoroughness. They'd prepared multiple waves of attack, each designed to destroy a different aspect of my life, while building their case for maximum financial gain. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a comprehensive campaign of personal and professional annihilation. I should really go, Margaret said, checking her watch again. Alan will be expecting me home soon, and maintaining the facade is crucial at this stage. Dan walked her to the door, their body language comfortable and familiar in a way that made my stomach churn. Remember, from now until June 15th, you're the devoted wife of a successful businessman. Supportive, grateful, completely unaware that your marriage is about to implode. Margaret paused at the threshold, her hand on the door handle. Dan, what happens afterward? I mean, after the divorce is final and the assets are divided? What happens to us? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications I didn't want to contemplate. Dan stepped closer to her, his voice dropping to something more intimate. That depends on what you want to happen, he said quietly. We'll both be free to make new choices about our futures. Margaret smiled, and for the first time in their entire conversation, her expression carried genuine warmth instead of calculated manipulation. I'd like that very much. They were planning to destroy two marriages, not just mine. Sarah would lose not only her relationship with her father, but her husband as well, though she didn't know it yet. The conspiracy wasn't just about money. It was about Margaret and Dan building a new life together on the wreckage of the families they were betraying. Go, Dan said softly, his hand briefly touching Margaret's arm. I'll call you tomorrow with updates on the final preparations. Margaret nodded and stepped outside, her heels clicking across the porch as she walked toward her car. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, watching as she climbed into the silver Lexus and backed out of the driveway with the same casual confidence she'd shown throughout their entire meeting. Dan stood in his doorway for several moments, watching her drive away before closing the door with obvious satisfaction. Through the window, I could see him returning to his desk, probably to review more details of their conspiracy or prepare additional documentation for my destruction. I remained hidden behind the bushes for another 10 minutes, making sure both of them had settled into their post-meeting routines before I crept back to my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, the recording device in my phone feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. 43 minutes of crystal-clear audio that would change everything. 43 minutes that documented not just their planned betrayal, but their casual cruelty, their calculated manipulation, their complete lack of remorse for the lives they intended to destroy. As I drove home through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, past the houses where we'd attended dinner parties and holiday gatherings, I felt like I was seeing everything through new eyes. How many of our mutual friends already knew about Margaret's plans? How many social interactions had been performances designed to gather information or build her case for victimhood? The house I'd built with my own hands looked different when I pulled into our driveway. Still beautiful, still impressive, but no longer the symbol of shared dreams and mutual accomplishment I'd always believed it to be. Now it was just another asset to be divided, another piece of property in Margaret's calculated quest for financial independence. I sat in my car for several minutes, staring at the front door I'd installed myself. thinking about the woman inside who was probably preparing whatever story would explain her absence from pottery class. How many lies had she told me over the past 2 years? How many conversations had been carefully scripted to avoid arousing my suspicions? The recording on my phone contained enough evidence to destroy their conspiracy completely, but using it would require a level of strategic thinking I'd never applied to personal relationships. This wasn't about construction contracts or business negotiations where the rules were clear and the objectives straightforward. This was about psychological warfare, legal maneuvering, and the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my family. Margaret and Dan thought they were playing chess with someone who didn't understand the game. They'd spent 2 years positioning their pieces while assuming I'd never noticed the board. But they'd made one critical mistake in all their careful planning. They'd underestimated the analytical mind that had built a construction empire from nothing, that had navigated 35 years of complex business relationships and challenging projects. The same strategic thinking that had made me successful in business would now be focused on a very different kind of problem solving. As I finally climbed out of my car and walked toward the front door, I felt something cold and determined settling in my chest. The shock was wearing off, replaced by the kind of methodical planning that had always served me well in difficult situations. Margaret and Dan had declared war on my life, my family, and everything I'd worked to build. They thought they held all the advantages, the element of surprise, superior legal representation, and 2 years of careful preparation. They were about to discover that their biggest advantage had just become their greatest vulnerability. Every detail they'd planned, every strategy they'd developed, every piece of evidence they'd gathered was now known to their intended victim. The game was about to change completely, and this time, I wouldn't be playing defense. Margaret's key turned in the front door lock, just as I finished composing myself in our living room. I heard her heels clicking across the marble entryway, the same sound that had once filled me with anticipation, now making my stomach clench with knowledge of her deception. "Alan, I'm home," she called out, her voice carrying that familiar warmth that I now recognized as pure performance. "Sorry I'm a bit late. We had such an interesting discussion about glazing techniques that I completely lost track of time." I looked up from the newspaper I'd been pretending to read, forcing my expression into something resembling normalcy. "How was pottery class, sweetheart? Make anything interesting today?" She appeared in the doorway, still beautiful at 62, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her makeup flawless despite supposedly spending 3 hours working with clay. Not a speck of dust on her designer blouse, not a trace of the creative mess that actual pottery work would leave behind. "Oh, you know how it is," she said with practiced casualness, settling her purse on the side table with the same routine she'd followed for months. "We mostly worked on technique today. Mrs. Henderson is still struggling with centering her clay properly." Mrs. Henderson, who I'd learned 2 hours ago was actually Margaret's unwitting alibi, probably had no idea her pottery struggles were being used to cover clandestine meetings with my son-in-law. The casual way Margaret deployed these lies, building them into our daily conversations like they were natural parts of our shared life, revealed just how long she'd been living this double existence. "That's nice, dear," I managed, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I stopped by the grocery store earlier, picked up those steaks you wanted for tomorrow night's dinner." Margaret smiled, the same radiant expression that had made me fall in love with her decades ago. "You're so thoughtful, Alan. I don't know what I'd do without you." The irony of her words hit me like a physical blow. She knew exactly what she'd do without me. She'd be $12 million richer and free to pursue whatever future she'd planned with Dan. Every gesture of gratitude, every expression of love, every moment of apparent contentment was nothing more than careful acting designed to keep me unsuspecting until their trap was ready to spring. "How was your day?" she asked, settling into her favorite chair with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in her deception. "Did you get a chance to check on Dan like Sarah asked?" The question was delivered with perfect innocence, but I caught the subtle way her eyes studied my face, searching for any sign that I might have discovered something unexpected. She was fishing for information while maintaining her cover story, probably wondering if Dan had mentioned their meeting or if I'd noticed anything unusual. "Actually, I got tied up at the Morrison site," I lied smoothly, watching her reaction carefully. Concrete delivery was delayed, and I had to coordinate with 3 different subcontractors to reschedule the pour. By the time everything was sorted out, it was too late to swing by Dan's place. Relief flickered across her features so quickly that anyone who hadn't been looking for it would have missed it entirely. But I'd been watching Margaret's micro expressions for 25 years, and I caught the momentary relaxation in her shoulders, the barely perceptible exhale that suggested she'd been holding her breath waiting for my answer. "That's too bad," she said with manufactured sympathy. "Sarah will be disappointed that you couldn't check on him. Maybe tomorrow?" "Maybe tomorrow," I agreed, my mind already calculating how to use her expectations against her. If she thought I hadn't discovered their conspiracy yet, she'd continue operating under the assumption that surprise was still on their side. That false confidence would be my greatest weapon in whatever came next. Margaret stood and walked to the kitchen, her movements casual and familiar. "I'll start dinner in a few minutes. Why don't you pour us some wine? That bottle of Cabernet we've been saving might be nice tonight." The suggestion carried an undertone of celebration that made my blood run cold. She wanted to toast something, though she couldn't tell me what. Perhaps the successful completion of another planning session with Dan, or maybe just the satisfaction of maintaining her deception for another day. I walked to our wine cabinet, my hands steady as I selected the bottle she'd mentioned. It was a 2015 vintage we'd bought during our trip to Sonoma 3 years ago, back when I'd still believed we were building memories together instead of her building a case against me. The irony of sharing it now wasn't lost on me. As I worked the corkscrew, I could hear Margaret moving around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, the sounds of our domestic routine continuing exactly as they had for years. Plates being removed from cabinets, silverware being arranged, the refrigerator opening and closing as she gathered ingredients for whatever meal she'd planned. Everything appeared perfectly normal, beautifully ordinary, the picture of a successful couple enjoying a quiet evening at home. But underneath that facade was a web of deception so complete that I was still struggling to process its full implications. "Alan!" Margaret called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that tone of casual conversation that had fooled me for 2 years. "Did you remember that the Pattersons invited us to their anniversary party next weekend?" I poured wine into 2 glasses, thinking about how Dave Patterson would react when he learned about the divorce proceedings that would threaten our business partnership. "I remember," I called back. "Should be nice. 40 years of marriage is quite an achievement." "Isn't it wonderful?" Margaret appeared in the doorway, accepting her wine glass, with a smile that looked genuine enough to fool anyone who hadn't heard her planning my destruction hours earlier. "I sometimes wonder if we'll make it that far. 47 years would make me nearly 80. The casual reference to our future together, spoken by someone who was actively planning to divorce me in less than 3 months, revealed the true depth of her psychological manipulation. She could discuss our imaginary golden years, while simultaneously preparing to destroy our actual present, switching between deception and reality with the skill of a professional actress. "Here's to the future," she said, raising her glass in a toast that felt like mockery. I clinked my glass against hers, meeting her eyes directly. "To getting exactly what we deserve." Margaret's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, as if some unconscious part of her mind had detected the double meaning in my words. But she recovered quickly, her expression returning to practiced warmth as she took a sip of wine. "This is delicious," she said, redirecting the conversation away from anything that might require deeper thought. "We should remember this vintage for special occasions." "Special occasions? Like divorce proceedings?" I thought grimly. Like the day when recording devices and legal documents would replace wine glasses and anniversary toasts. Like the moment when 25 years of marriage would be reduced to asset division and custody arrangements. Over dinner, Margaret maintained her performance flawlessly, discussing neighborhood gossip and social commitments with the same enthusiasm she'd always shown. She mentioned her book club's selection for next month, asked about my plans for the Morrison project, and wondered aloud whether we should refinish the hardwood floors in the guest bedroom. Every word was a lie by omission. Every question was designed to gather intelligence while maintaining her cover. Every expression of interest in our shared future was a calculated deception meant to keep me unsuspecting until June 15th arrived with its legal ambush. But I played my part too, responding with appropriate interest and enthusiasm while my mind worked through the strategic implications of everything I'd learned. The recording on my phone contained enough evidence to destroy their conspiracy completely, but timing would be crucial. Moving too quickly might allow them to adapt their plans or find new ways to attack me. After dinner, as Margaret settled in front of the television with her usual cup of herbal tea, I retreated to my home office under the pretense of reviewing project specifications. But instead of construction documents, I was planning something far more complex and consequential. The war Margaret and Dan had declared on my life was about to become a two-sided conflict. They'd spent 2 years positioning their pieces while assuming I'd remain ignorant of the game being played around me. That assumption was about to become their greatest strategic mistake. I opened my laptop and began researching divorce attorneys with reputations for aggressive defense strategies. If Margaret wanted a legal battle, she'd get one. But this time, her opponent would be fully prepared, completely informed, and absolutely determined to win. The game had changed, and by the time Margaret realized what was happening, it would be far too late for her to adjust her strategy or find new allies. She'd taught me that trust was a weakness that could be exploited. Now she was about to learn what happened when that lesson was applied by someone who truly understood the stakes involved.